There are many words commonly used today to describe political attitudes. We are told there are conservatives, liberals, libertarians, progressives, right-wingers, left-wingers, socialists, fascists, communists and Nazis. In addition, you have political party labels. You might feel that you belong to the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. Likewise, in other nations you have a Labour Party and a Conservative Party, and yet not one person in 1,000 can clearly define the ideology that any of these words represent. They are used primarily as labels to impart an aura of either goodness or badness, depending on who uses the words and what emotions they trigger in their minds. Most political debates sound like they originate at the Tower of Babel. Everyone is speaking a different language. The words may sound familiar, but speakers and listeners each have their own private definitions. If we are to make sense of the political agendas that dominate our planet today, we must not allow our thinking to be contaminated by the emotional load of the old vocabulary, because once definitions are commonly understood, most of the disagreements come to an end. To the amazement of those who thought they were bitter ideological opponents, they often find they are actually in basic agreement. It may surprise you to learn that most of the great political debates of our time can be divided into just two viewpoints. All of the rest is fluff. Typically, they focus on whether or not a particular action should be taken, but the real conflict is not about the merits of the action, it is about the principles, the ethical code that justifies or forbids that action. It is a contest between the ethics of collectivism on the one hand and individualism on the other. Those are words that have meaning, and they describe a philosophical chasm that divides the entire Western world. The one thing that is common to both collectivists and individualists is that the vast majority of them are well-intentioned. They want the best life possible for their families, for their countrymen, and for mankind. They want prosperity and justice for their fellow man. Where they disagree is how to bring those things about. This series will explore the research done over 45 years by Mr. G. Edward Griffin about the 5 major concepts of social and political relationships, and within each of them, the opposite viewpoints of collectivism and individualism. The first of these concerns the origin and nature of human rights. Part 1 of this series will show where rights are derived from. Does an individual have rights simply because a law guarantees them? It is important to determine where rights originate from, both for governments and individuals, because the universal rule is, a right source determines their nature. Where does the justification for protecting those rights come from, and where does an individual or government claim their authority from when they exert force over others in protecting those rights? Part 2 will examine the concept of group supremacy. We will look at the difference between a republic and a democracy and study what it means to be a group. Does a group have groups' rights? Are those rights greater than the individual's rights? And where is this greater good mentality that dictates collectivist policy likely to lead us? In Part 3, we look to the divide between collectivism and individualism regarding coercion versus freedom, primarily a question of charity. The issue of charity is a two-part question. First, what is to be achieved, and then how to achieve it. As mentioned earlier, both sides generally agree on the first part of the question, that charity is good and that we should help less fortunate individuals. However, they disagree on how they should be helped. Collectivists favour a Robin Hood syndrome, using government and taxes to redistribute wealth, and paint individualists as selfish for objecting to this. Individualists, on the other hand, advocate voluntary actions and feel that such use of force undermines the truth of the term charity. In Part 4, we examine equality and inequality under law. Collectivists believe themselves to be social engineers and use government to enforce racial or gender quotas in order to bring about a more equal society. Individualists disagree and state that while we are all unequal, we all deserve the same equality under the law, and to favour one class or race above another is unequal and it further divides society. The final part of this series explores the proper role of government, the difference between an individualist and a collectivist state, and where each government will take its society. By the end of this series, you will be aware of how each new collectivist law, further regulating society, undermines individual freedom and liberty and begins the inevitable slope towards totalitarianism. collectivists and individualists both agree that human rights are important, but they differ over how important compared to other values, and especially over the origin of those rights. Rights are not tangible entities that can be viewed or measured. They are abstract concepts held in the human mind. They are whatever men agree they are at a given time and place. Because of the great diversity in the concept of human rights, they cannot be defined to everyone's satisfaction. But if we wish to live in a culture with the optimum amount of personal freedom, then we must be serious about a preferred definition of human rights. Because if we have no concept of what our rights should be, then it is likely that we will live under a definition not to our liking. The first thing to understand as we work towards a useful definition of rights is that their source determines their nature. This will be covered in greater detail further along, but the concept needs to be stated here. If we can agree on a source of rights, then we will have little difficulty agreeing on their nature. For example, if a security guard is hired by a gated community to protect the property of its residents, the nature of the guard's activity must be limited to the activities that the residents themselves are entitled to perform. That means the guard may patrol the community and, if necessary, physically deter burglaries and crimes of aggressive violence. But the guard is not authorized to compel residents to send their children to bed by 10 p.m. or to donate to the Red Cross. Why not? Because the residents are the source of the authority. The nature of the authority cannot include any act that is denied to the source, and the residents have no right to compel their neighbors in these matters. In societies that have been sheltered for many generations from war and revolution, it is easy to forget that rights are derived from military power. That is their ultimate source. Initially, rights must be earned on the battlefield. They may be handed to the next generation as a gift, but they are always purchased on the battlefield. The Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution is a classic example. The men who drafted that document were able to do so only because they represented the colonists who defeated the armies of Great Britain. Had they lost the War of Independence, they would have had no opportunity to write a Bill of Rights or anything else except letters of farewell before their execution. Unfortunately, Mao Zedong was right when he said that political power grows from the barrel of a gun. He could just as well have said rights. A man may declare that he has a right to do such and such derived from law or from a constitution or even from God, but in the presence of a criminal or a tyrant with a gun to his head, he has no power to exercise his proclaimed right. Rights are always based on power. If we lose our ability or our willingness to physically defend our rights, we will lose them. Now we come to the chasm between collectivists and individualists. If rights are earned on the battlefield, we may assume that they belong to the winners, but who are they? Do governments win wars, or do the people? If governments win wars and the people merely serve them, as in medieval times, then governments hold the rights and are entitled to grant or deny them to the people. On the other hand, if people win wars and governments merely serve them in this matter, then the people hold rights and are entitled to grant or deny them to governments. If our task is to define rights as we think they should be in a free society, then we must choose between these two concepts. Collectivists choose the concept that rights come from governments and that people are the servants. Individualists are nervous about this assumption because if the state has the power to grant rights, it also has the power to take them away, and that concept is incompatible with personal liberty. The view of individualism was expressed clearly in the United States Declaration of Independence, which said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men." The assumption is that rights are the innate possession of the people. The purpose of government is not to grant rights, but to secure them and protect them. By contrast, all collectivist political systems embrace the opposite view, that rights are granted by the state. That includes the Nazis, fascists, and communists. It is also a tenet of the United Nations. Article 4 of the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says, "The states parties to the present covenant recognize that, in the enjoyment of those rights provided by the state may subject such rights only to such limitations as are determined by law." I repeat, if we accept that the state has the power to grant rights, then we must also agree that it has the power to take them away. Notice the wording of the UN Covenant. After proclaiming that rights are provided by the state, it then says that those rights may be subject to limitations as are determined by law. In other words, the collectivists at the United Nations presume to grant us our rights, and then, when they are ready to take them away, all they have to do is pass a law authorizing it. Compare that with the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. It says that Congress shall pass no law restricting the rights of freedom of speech or religion, peaceful assembly, the right to bear arms and so forth, not except as are determined by law, but no law. The United States Constitution embodies the ethic of individualism. The UN embodies the ethic of collectivism, and what a difference it makes. We can see that individualists believe that the state cannot have any legitimate powers unless they are given it by the citizens. Another way of putting it is that governments may only do those things that their citizens also have a right to do. If individuals don't have a right to perform a certain act, then they can't grant that power to their elected representatives. They can't delegate what they don't have. It makes no matter how many of them there may be. If none of them have a specified power to delegate, then a million of them don't have it either. Let us use an extreme example of 3 men afloat at sea struggling over a piece of debris that will only support 2 of them. Both collectivists and individualists would say that the 2 men would be justified in overpowering the third. The collectivist points out the greater good for the greater number. However, if we simplify the example so that there are only 2 men and the debris will only support 1 of them, we can see that an individual would still be justified in overpowering the other, because the right to self-survival is paramount. We can see that in the original example, there is no need for any group right to justify overpowering the third individual. When each man acts, they do it for their own individual right of self-survival. Using physical force to protect our lives, liberty, and property is the legitimate function of government, because that power is derived from the people as individuals. It does not arise from the group. Here's a more typical example. If government officials decide one day that no one should work on a Sunday, and even assuming the community generally supports their decision, where would they get the authority to use the police power of the state to enforce such a decree? Individual citizens don't have a right to compel their neighbours not to work, so they can't delegate that right to their governments. So where then would the state get the authority? The answer is that it would come from itself. It would be self-generated. When governments claim to derive their authority from any source other than the governed, it always leads to the destruction of liberty. Preventing men from working on a Sunday would not seem to be a great threat to freedom, but once the principle is established, it opens the door for more edicts, and more, until freedom is gone. If we accept that the state or any group has the right to do things that individuals alone do not have the right to do, then we have unwittingly endorsed the concept that rights are not intrinsic to the individual, and that they in fact do originate with the state. Once we accept that, we are on the road to tyranny. As we shall see in part 2, collectivists are not concerned over such picky issues. They believe that governments do in fact have powers that are greater than those of the citizens, and the source of those powers, they say, is not the individuals in society, but society itself. The next concept that divides collectivism from individualism is group supremacy. Collectivism is based on the belief that the group is more important than the individual. According to this view, the group is an entity of its own, and it has rights of its own. Furthermore, those rights are more important than individual rights. Therefore, it is acceptable to sacrifice individuals if necessary for the greater good of the greater number. Who can object to the loss of liberty if it is justified as necessary for the greater good of society? The ultimate group is, of course, the state. Therefore, the state is more important than individual citizens, and it is acceptable to sacrifice individuals if necessary for the benefit of the state. This concept is at the heart of all modern totalitarian systems, built on the model of collectivism. Individualists, on the other hand, argue that there is no such thing as a group. You can't touch a group, you can't see a group. All you can touch and see are individuals. The word group is an abstraction that does not exist as a tangible reality. It's like the abstraction called a forest. Forests do not exist. only trees exist. Forest is the concept of many trees. Likewise, the word group merely describes the abstract concept of many individuals. Only individuals are real, and therefore there is no such thing as group rights. Only individuals have rights. Just because there are many individuals in one group and only a few in another does not give a higher priority to the individuals in the larger group, even if you call it the state. A majority of voters do not have more rights than the minority. Rights are not derived from the power of numbers. They do not come from the group. They are intrinsic with each human being. When someone argues that individuals must be sacrificed for the greater good of society, what they are really saying is that some individuals are to be sacrificed for the greater good of other individuals. The morality of collectivism is based on numbers. Anything may be done so long as the number of people benefiting is supposedly greater than the number of people being sacrificed. I say supposedly because, in the real world, those who decide who is to be sacrificed don't count fairly. Dictators always claim that they represent the greater good of the greater number, but in reality, they and their support organisations usually comprise less than 1% of the population. The theory is that someone has to speak for the masses and represent their best interest because they are too dumb to figure it out for themselves. So collectivist leaders, wise and virtuous as they are, make decisions for them. In this way, it is possible to explain any atrocity or injustice as a necessary measure for the greater good of society. Modern totalitarians always parade themselves as humanitarians. Because individuals do not accept group supremacy, collectivists often portray them as being selfish and insensitive to the needs of others. That theme is common in schools today. If a child is not willing to go along with the group, he is criticised as being socially disruptive and not a good team player or a good citizen. But individualism is not based on ego. It is based on principle. If you accept the premise that individuals may be sacrificed for the group, you have made a large mistake on two counts. First, individuals are the essence of the group, which means the group is being sacrificed anyway, piece by piece. Secondly, the underlying principle is deadly. Today, the individual being sacrificed may be unknown to you or even someone you dislike. Tomorrow, it could be you. It takes but a moment's reflection to realise that the greater good of the greater number is not achieved by sacrificing individuals, but by protecting individuals. Society is best served by individualism, not collectivism. We are dealing here with one of the reasons that people make a distinction between republics and democracies. In recent years, we have been taught to believe that a democracy is the ideal form of government. Supposedly, that is what was created by the American Constitution. But closer examination of the documents and the speech transcripts of the men who wrote the Constitution, you find that they spoke very poorly of democracy. They said in plain words that a democracy was one of the worst possible forms of government, and so they created what they called a republic. That is why the word democracy doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, and when Americans pledge allegiance to the flag, it is to the republic for which it stands, not the democracy. The reason this is important is that the difference between a democracy and a republic is the difference between collectivism and individualism. In a pure democracy, the majority rules. Consider a lynch mob. There is only one person with a dissenting vote, and he is at the end of a rope. That is pure democracy in action. A republic is a government based on the principle of limited majority rule, so that the minority, even a minority of one, will be protected from the whims and passions of the majority. Republics are often characterized by written constitutions that spell out the rules that make that possible. That was the function of the American Bill of Rights, which is nothing more than a list of things that the government may not do. It says that Congress, even though it represents the majority, shall pass no law denying the minority their rights to free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, the right to bear arms, and other unalienable rights. These limitations on majority rule are the essence of a republic, and they are also at the core of the ideology called individualism. There is another major difference between these two concepts. Collectivism on the one hand, supporting any government action so long as it can be said to be for the greater good of the greater number, and individualism on the other hand, defending the rights of the minority against the passions and greed of the majority. In the next part of this series, we look to the divide over coercion versus freedom. We will examine the collectivist morality that justifies the use of force to deprive individuals from private property, if it is for charitable reasons, and the individualist morality that believes that voluntary actions are at the core of the term charity. The third concept that divides collectivism from individualism has to do with responsibilities and freedom of choice. We have spoken about the origin of rights, but there is a similar issue involving the origin of responsibilities. Rights and responsibilities go together. If you value the right to live your own life without others telling you what to do, then you must assume the responsibility to be independent and to provide for yourself without expecting others to take care of you. Rights and responsibilities are merely different sides of the same coin. If only individuals have rights, then it follows that only individuals have responsibilities. If groups have rights, then groups also have responsibilities, and therein lies one of the greatest ideological challenges of our modern age. Individualists are the champions of individual rights. Therefore, they accept the principle of individual responsibility rather than group responsibility. They believe that everyone has a personal and direct obligation to provide first for himself and his family, and then for others who may be in need. That does not mean that they don't believe in helping each other. Just because someone is an individualist does not mean that they would have to move something like their piano by themselves. It just means that moving it is their responsibility, not someone else's, and it's up to them to organise the voluntary assistance of others. The collectivist, on the other hand, declares that individuals are not personally responsible for charity, for raising their own children, providing for aging parents, or even providing for themselves. These are group obligations of the state. The individualist expects to do it himself, and the collectivist wants the government to do it for him, to provide employment and healthcare, a minimum wage, food, education, and a decent place to live. Collectivists are enamoured by government. They worship it and are fixated by government as the ultimate group mechanism to solve all problems. Individualists do not share this faith, and they see government as the creator of more problems than it solves. They believe that freedom of choice will lead to the best solution of social and economic problems by comparing millions of ideas and efforts, each one subject to trial and error and competition. The results are far superior to what can be achieved by a group of politicians or a committee of so-called wise men. By contrast, collectivists do not trust freedom. They are afraid of freedom. They are convinced that freedom may be alright in small matters such as what colour socks you want to wear, but when it comes to important issues such as the money supply, banking practices, investments, insurance programs, healthcare, education and so on, freedom will not work. These things, they say, simply must be controlled by the government. Otherwise, there would be chaos. There are two reasons for the popularity of this concept. The first is that most of us have been educated in government schools, and this is what we were taught. The second is that the government is the one group that can legally force everyone to participate. It has the power of taxation, backed by jails and force of arms to compel everyone to fall in line, and that is a very appealing concept to the intellectual who pictures himself as a social engineer. They believe it is their obligation to mankind as the enlightened ones to make decisions on the behalf of society, for most are too dumb to know what their own best interests are. Individualists also believe that they are right, and that the masses seldom do what they should, but they do not accept that you can force people to comply with your will. To do this would be to establish a principle that would open the door for others, representing larger groups, to compel them to act as they decree, and that would be the end of freedom. One of the quickest ways to spot a collectivist is to see how he reacts to public problems. No matter what bothers him in his daily routine, whether it's littering the highway, smoking in public, dressing indecently, bigotry, or even sending out junk mail, his immediate response is, "There ought to be a law." Of course, the professionals in government who make a living from coercion are more than happy to cooperate. The consequence is that government just keeps growing and growing. It is a one-way street. Every year there are more and more laws and less freedom. Each law by itself seems relatively benign, justified by some convenience or for the greater good of the greater number, but the process continues forever until government is total and freedom is dead. Bit by bit, the people themselves become the solicitor of their own enslavement. A good example of this collectivist mindset is the use of government to perform acts of charity. Most people believe that we have a responsibility to help others in need. But what about those who disagree? Those who couldn't care less about the needs of others? Should they be allowed to be selfish while the rest of us are so generous? The collectivist sees people like this as justification for the use of coercion, because the cause is so worthy. Of course, not all of it gets to the poor. It takes a giant bureaucracy to administer a public charity, and the individuals in government have become accustomed to a large portion of that wealth, while the rest are grateful for whatever they can get. They don't care how much is consumed in the process because, after all, it was stolen from someone else anyway. We all know the biblical story of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help a stranger who had been robbed and beaten. But what would we think if the Samaritan had pointed his sword at the next traveller and threatened to kill him if he didn't also help? At that point, the Samaritan would have been no different to the original robber, whose motive for attacking the victim could well have been to feed his family or to afford a better doctor for his wife. Regardless, a crime done for virtuous motives is a crime nonetheless. When coercion enters, charity leaves. Individualists believe that a person should be free not to be charitable. If they prefer to give to a different charity, if they prefer to give a smaller amount, or if they prefer not to give at all, there is no right to force him to our will. We may try to persuade him, we may appeal to his conscience, and especially we may show the way by our own good example. But individualists reject any attempt to gang up on him, either by physically restraining him while removing money from his pockets, or by using the ballot box to pass laws that will take his money through taxation. In either case, the principle is the same. It's called stealing. Collectivists would have you believe that individualism is merely another word for selfishness, because individualists oppose welfare and other forms of coercive redistribution of wealth. But just the opposite is true. Individualists advocate true charity, which is the voluntary giving of their own money, while collectivists advocate the coercive giving of other people's money, which is of course why it is so popular. One of the most popular slogans of Marxism is, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." That is the cornerstone of theoretical socialism, and it is a very appealing concept, but it is incomplete. The unanswered question is, how is this to be accomplished? Shall it be in freedom or through coercion? For the individualist, a worthy objective does not justify committing theft and surrendering freedom, while for the collectivist, the ends justify the means. In the next part of this series, we examine equality and inequality under law. We will study how collectivists use government for welfare and to enforce racial or gender quotas in order to bring about a more equal society, and also the opposite view of individualism, that regardless of personal inequalities of means or circumstance, we all deserve the same equality under the law. The next concept that divides collectivism from individualism has to do with the way that people are treated under the law. Individualists believe that no two people are exactly alike, and that each one is superior or inferior to others in a huge variety of ways, but that under the law, they should all be treated equally. Collectivists believe that the law should treat people unequally in order to bring about desirable changes in society. They view the world as tragically imperfect. They see poverty and suffering and injustice, and they conclude that something must be done to alter the forces that have produced these effects. They think of themselves as social engineers who have the wisdom to restructure society to a more humane and logical order. To do this, they must interfere in the affairs of men at all levels and redirect their activities according to the master plan. That means they must redistribute wealth and use the police power of the state to enforce prescribed behaviour. The consequence of this mindset can be seen everywhere in society today. Almost every country in the world has a tax system designed to treat people unequally depending on their income, their marital status, the number of children they have, their age, and even the type of investments they may have. The purpose of this arrangement is to redistribute wealth, which means to favour some classes over others. In some cases, there are bizarre loopholes written into the tax laws just to favour one corporation or one politically influential group. Other laws provide tax exemption and subsidies to favoured groups or corporations. Inequality is the sole purpose of these laws. In the realm of social relationships, there are laws to establish racial quotas, gender quotas, affirmative action initiatives, and to prohibit expressions of opinion that may be objectionable to some group or to the master planners. In all of these measures, there is an unequal application of the law based on what group or class you happen to be in, or on what opinion you hold. We are told that all of this is necessary to accomplish a desirable change in society, and yet, after more than 100 years of social engineering, there is not one place on the globe where collectivists can point with pride and show where their master plan has actually worked as they predicted. Let us use an example of a basketball league, where some of the teams were forced during the last season to play with one arm tied behind their backs, while others could play without constraint. Of course, neither individualists nor collectivists would consider this arrangement fair. Now suppose that someone proposed for the next several seasons, those teams whose players had been untied were now to play all of their games with one arm tied behind their backs, while those who had been tied up now had both arms free. Is the arrangement now fair? Before we answer, let's improve the analogy. Let's observe that there has been a complete turnover of players. All those who played in the first set of games have retired. The current players, therefore, are newcomers, none of whom were involved in the original practice. Let's ask again, is the arrangement now fair? It is important to identify one crucial premise in this example. It identifies the players as individuals rather than members of a collective team. Let us use a more contemporary example of groups who, historically, have had the rules of the game biased against them, such as the indigenous peoples of Australia and Canada or the Native Americans of the United States. Their struggle has been against the racism and inequality that inhibits their opportunities. Both collectivists and individualists would agree that the rules of the game need to be changed so that they can play with both hands untied. But what would we say if collectivists went even further and changed the rules so that the ancestors of native people were guaranteed employment, given welfare payments, or even made exempt from paying taxes just because they belong to the group, regardless of how well off the individual may be? In their quest for equal rights, is the collectivist strategy for swapping negative inequality for positive inequality likely to be successful? The individualist believes that this path breeds further resentment as it continues the fostering of a society that only sees each other as members of groups, eternally different and forever struggling for preferential treatment under the law at the expense of others. There have been many books written about the collectivist utopia, but they have never materialized in the real world. Wherever collectivism has been applied, the results have always been more poverty than before, more suffering than before, and certainly more injustice than before. Individualism is based on the premise that all citizens should be equal under law, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or political opinion. No class should be given preferential treatment, regardless of the merit or popularity of its cause. To favour one class over another is not equality under law. In the final part of this series, we explore the proper role of government. We look at the difference between an individualist and a collectivist state, and where each government will take its society. The time has come to do away with all of the confusing definitions, the illusion of opposites, and the myth that the world is too complicated to properly understand. All of these issues are far more simple than we could have imagined. There is the approach of collectivism and the approach of individualism. Now that we have examined the true origin of human rights, the fallacy of group supremacy, the immorality of using coercion, and the need for equality under law, one question remains: what is the proper role of government? Collectivists believe that the proper role of the government should be positive, that the state should take the initiative in all aspects of the affairs of men, that it should be aggressive, lead and provide. It should be the great organizer of society. Individualists believe that the proper function of government is negative and defensive. It is not to provide, but to protect. For if the state is granted the power to provide for some, it must also be able to take from others. And once that power is granted, there are those who would seek it for their advantage. It always leads to legalized plunder and the loss of freedom. If government is powerful enough to give us everything we want, it is also powerful enough to take from us everything we have. Therefore, the proper function of government is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, and nothing more. We hear a lot today about right-wingers versus left-wingers, but what do those terms really mean? For example, we are told that communists and socialists are at the extreme left, and that the Nazis and fascists are on the extreme right. Here we have the image of two powerful ideological adversaries pitted against each other, and the impression is that somehow they are opposites. But what is the difference? They are not opposites at all. They are the same. The insignias may be different, but when you analyse communism and Nazism, they both embody the principles of socialism. Communists are clear that they embody socialism, and the Nazi movement in Germany was actually called the National Socialist Party. Communists believe in international socialism, whereas Nazis advocate national socialism. Communists promote class hatred and class conflict to motivate loyalty and blind obedience to their followers, whereas the Nazis use race conflict and race hatred to accomplish that same objective. Other than that, there is no difference between communism and Nazism. They are both the epitome of collectivism, and yet we are told that they are at opposite ends of the spectrum. There is only one thing that makes sense in constructing a political spectrum, and that is to put zero government at one end and 100% at the other. Now we have something that we can comprehend. Those who believe in zero government are the anarchists, and those who believe in total government are the totalitarians. With that definition, we find that communism and Nazism are together at the same end. They are both totalitarian. Why? Because they are both based on the model of collectivism. Communism, Nazism, fascism and socialism all gravitate towards bigger and bigger government because that is the logical extension of their common ideology. Under collectivism, all problems are the responsibility of the state and must be solved by the state. The more problems there are, the more powerful the state must become. If you accept the principle that government must solve society's problems, you get on a slippery slope, and there is no place to stop until you reach all the way to the end of the scale, which is total government. Regardless of what name you give it, regardless of how you relabel it to make it seem new or different, collectivism is totalitarianism. In fact, the straight line concept of a political spectrum is somewhat misleading. It is really a circle. You can take that straight line with 100% government at one end and zero at the other, bend it round and touch the ends at the top. Now it is a circle, because under anarchy, where there is no government, you have absolute rule by those with the biggest fists and the most powerful weapons. So you jump from zero government to totalitarianism in a flash. They meet at the top. When dealing with a circle, the only logical place for us to be is somewhere in the middle of the extremes. We need social and political organisation, of course, but it must be built on individualism, an ideology with an affinity to that part of the spectrum with the least amount of government possible, instead of collectivism, with an affinity at the other end of the spectrum with the most amount of government possible. That government is best which governs least.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.